Hello, folks. Good evening or afternoon, depending on where you are. Mark Scott returns to World War II TV to share an amazing story. It concerns two young children and a Kindertransport from Austria in 1939. His book, Transport Number 4, is in the links below. Of course, it's in the links below, as is his previous appearance on World War II TV talking about the Royal Ulster Rifles. I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Mark. How are you today?
Hi, Paul. I'm good. Yeah, good to see you.
And we won't spoil what we're going to be talking about in a minute, but this is one of those stories that goes off in so many different directions, bringing various parts of the world, and I'll let you explain more when we bring up the PowerPoint. But it kind of starts off from the Royal Ulster Rifles book and work you did, in that you met someone and went on there. And do you feel that in your that's the best way, in some way, that's the best way to find a story? Is it kind of happens completely randomly? Because if you go out and search for something, you'll where do you look? But suddenly, you meet the right person and there's a story.
I find this is my fourth book. The first two were World War I, and then the third one that you mentioned, I'll plug it here, was this one. Fought on D-Day. And I find that it's like writing a book and then getting it published. It's like the chase is better than the catch. You do all the research and you get excited about it and you find out new things, and then it gets published, and then you do things like this with you, and then you just go, it's what am I going to do now? And thankfully, up until now, things have just landed on my lap. And this story, Transport Number 4, Vienna, 1941, leads directly back to the We Fought on D-Day book.
Right.
In that a journalist from Northern Ireland here called Charlie Warmington called round at my house to write a review for the Belfast newspaper on the D-Day book. And if you can remember the D-Day story, I mean, your uncle featured in it. And there's similarities in that your uncle corroborated a little one-liner that one of the Ulster riflemen had said, and that led to uncovering the murder of 4 riflemen at the hands of the 12th SS. And I sort of explained this to Charlie Warmington, the journalist, and I said, Charlie, I sort of have a go at the Nazis here. I hope you're all right with that. And he says, Mark, my mother came to Northern Ireland on a Kindertransport. Her name was Kessler, Gertrude Kessler. She came here in 1939. I don't know what happened in Vienna to her family after she left. All I know is that she came here in 1939. I have 2 uncles. The Gestapo pulled them in for plotting to kill Hitler, and they were murdered by having dogs set on them. And there is a memorial somewhere in Austria to them, but I don't know where, and I don't know anything else about it. So that was his one-liner, if you like, similar to the D-Day one. So he wrote his review and he left, and the reviews came out in the newspaper. He actually did 2, which was very generous. And the reviews came out in the newspaper. And for about 2 weeks afterwards, I was in that doldrum of not knowing what to do next. But this was bouncing about in my head, dogs and, killing Hitler and all the rest of it. And one day he rang me, and it was just like a follow-up, really. And by that stage, I'd got it. If I ever talk to this man again, I'm going to ask him. And I just came out with it and said, Charlie, can I have a chance at looking at this story that you don't know much about, the Vienna story? And he says, Mark, I've got 3 emails on my computer addressed to you, asking you exactly that in reverse. And I haven't had the nerve to press the send button. And I said, right, Charlie, here we are. So that's how it all kicked off. So it's all your fault, Paul. It's all
well, I will take full responsibility. So there you are. We'll bring up your slides. So I'm going to hand over to Mark today, because there's the first slide. There is to Charlie, who gave you the seed of this, and it was his grandmother. And folks, if you have any questions you want for clarifying things, please feel free to jump in. But I think a lot of the questions will be answered as we go along. But I'm going to hand over to Mark to take us through this story. And fascinating. As soon as you told me about it in the email, I was hooked as well. So over to you, sir.
Okay, well, that's a good start. It's always good to have a hook in a story, isn't it? So this, as you can see from the outset, Charlie Warmington sadly passed away at the end of November, just passed a couple of months back. So he didn't actually hang around to see the finished book. quite sadly. He was 75 years old, but he did know everything, almost everything that was in it. So I was able to fulfill that brief, if you like, of discovering what happened to his family before he passed away, which is, it was quite an achievement. For some reason, I just hammered on with this one and got on with the research, and it's as well that I did, really, But so this is the front cover of the book. The photograph there is actually, it's the Berlin Holocaust Memorial. It's a photograph I took, and it shows a little boy. He just happened to be caught the moment I took the photograph. And on the rear cover of the book, which you can't see there, it's a photograph. It shows Charlie himself standing opposite one of the massive flak towers that are in the Augarten Tower in Vienna. And I've linked the two together. If you like, there's a young boy lost in the Holocaust. He doesn't know what happened to his family. And in the end, there's Charlie coming out of the light, if you like, enlightened with the information that I was able to give him. So I'll move on here. So this was Charlie's mother, aged 15, Gertrude Kessler. This was the identification card that was given to her in Northern Ireland as soon as she arrived at the end of her Kindertransport evacuation. You can see there her parents, Leopold and Ernestine Kessler, and their address, Strefflergasse, it's shortened there, Streffler G, in Vienna in the 20th district. So what Charlie knew about what happened in Vienna was based on this girl's memory, if you like. So he was working on 15-year-old memory all those years ago. And you have to bear in mind that Gertrude was evacuated in April 1939, just before the war started. And she didn't know anything about what happened after she left Vienna. And this was the problem. Charlie thought that she did know, perhaps, and she maybe just wasn't telling him for whatever reason, that he wasn't old enough or responsible enough to learn. But the sad fact was, and I actually uncovered a document that outlined this, the fact was that she just didn't know. And again, when Charlie was told that, it was quite an emotional thing to him, because he had sort of beat himself up over this, So we were left with this little one-liner of family history about dogs and the Gestapo and all the rest of it. And in my previous books, this sort of thing has happened. And I've done a lot of research outside of books for people, family research, World War I thing, World War II. And there's usually a little family myth, like a little story that's handed down. And sometimes it gets embellished, and sometimes, it gets degraded over the years. But I've always found that there's something there that it is based on truth.
Yeah, there's always a kernel of truth to it.
There's an element to it. So with that in mind, I started to explore the story here. And the other thing that I wanted to do, or that I had to do, was put documents, paperwork, things on the ground, and try and get them in context with one another, and not just look at something on the face of it. And you'll see later how that blew up the whole story in a really good way, But so Gertrude and her little brother, she was 15, her little brother, 13-year-old, they were evacuated from Vienna. Their parents, Leopold and Ernestine, before the Anschluss, obviously could see over the fence into Germany, if you like, and could see what was going on there with the Nuremberg laws, the race laws, and how the Jewish people were being persecuted. Ernestine, Gertrude's mother, wasn't actually a Jew. Leopold was, but he renounced Judaism in 1922 to facilitate his marriage, pardon me, to Ernestine. So the family, they didn't attend synagogue, they didn't attend Catholic church. Gertrude has made oral history recordings, and she would say herself that they were just non-religious. They just didn't go to church. Unfortunately, that didn't hold much water with Hitler, and the family started to become persecuted, moved from house to house. They were essentially robbed over a period of time by the Nazi regime. And they decided, right, we've got to get our children out, and we don't know what's going to happen to us, but at least if we can get them out, fair enough. Which isn't a good thing when you think of it. People think of the Kindertransport as if, oh yeah, brilliant, all the children got out. But if you put yourself in these people's shoes, how is that good when you have two young children? You're standing at a railway station and off they go, and you never know if you're going to see them again.
Yeah,
it's an awful thing. The problem the family had was that the Jewish Council, the IKG as it was called, they wouldn't help the family because they didn't attend synagogue. So they were way down the list, if you like, for help from them. The Kindertransport system was in place, but you had to go through these established routes, if you like. Similarly, the Catholic Church, again, they didn't attend there, so they wouldn't help them. So the family didn't know what to do, and they discovered that the Society of Friends, the Quakers, had established a Kindertransport link, and they went to them. This is a photograph of the Vienna meeting, as it's called, of the Society of Friends. And I'll point out the two ladies standing at the rear of that photograph. On the right of the screen there is Bridget Kelsey Hodgkin. Her name at that, this is 1938. Prior to that, she was known as just Bridget Kelsey, and she married a guy called Hodgkin, and that there should be a hyphen in there, but there isn't. And on the other side of the tall chap at the back is another young lady called Mary Campbell. So these two people, Mary Campbell left Vienna. A lot of the others in the picture here, once the war started, if you like, those aligned with Allied countries, the British, and there's Americans in the photograph, they had to leave Vienna. And then when the Americans joined the war, then obviously the American Quakers had also to leave and, get out. So the office was stripped way down. So Mary Campbell went to London, and Bridget Kelsey remained in Vienna for as long as she could. And she was specifically in charge of the children, the evacuation of the children from there. So when Gertrude and her brother left, they went via Holland, and then from Hook of Holland by ship to Harwich. Everyone else were found sponsored parents, if you like, almost like foster parents at that point. However, Gertrude and her brother Fritz, they had to keep on going to Northern Ireland. They were very lucky. So they ended up then on another train journey, another boat journey, and they ended up here and eventually were settled in a place called, it was an orphanage, an existing orphanage, and it was repurposed then to also accept refugees, a place called Childhaven in Millisle, little village called Millisle in County Down in Northern Ireland. So she settled here. As far as documents and research, you have to remember that if there's anything here relating to Vienna, it had to come with Gertrude. She was allowed to bring a little suitcase, and all they were permitted to carry was 2 weeks worth of change of clothing. They weren't allowed any money, nothing else. Their mother, Ernestine, managed to put into that case, we believe, 25 shilling, Austrian 25 shilling coins, which are the equivalent of like gold sovereigns, if you like, that we would have. They'd, once the Reichsmark took over, they had no monetary value, but they'd value anywhere, I suppose, in their weight in gold. These, we think, were either hidden into clothing, sewn into clothing, or hidden in the little case because they turned up in the family much later. There was also a couple of photographs, and their school reports, which they were actually required to have for the Kindertransport system, in order to sort of prove their CV, if you like, albeit they were, they're just little kids. So a few documents like that came with them, and we have them today. So what does a mother, if you like, give her daughter when she has actually got nothing left? Everything's been taken from her. They've been moved out of their homes into shared accommodation in Vienna. And what Ernestine came up with was a cookbook. And this is it. It was basically a little notebook. And all of the pages prior to the two that you see here were filled up with cooking and baking recipes. And when you think about it, what does a mother give a daughter when she doesn't have that chance? A 15-year-old girl, and she's taken from her, and she doesn't get explaining the ways of the world, if you like, to her, and all the rest of it. And what on earth would you do? But she sat down and wrote every recipe she knew into this little book. And Charlie benefited from that, because he told me stories of when he was growing up. The family eventually settled in Enniskillen in Northern Ireland. And when he was growing up, his friends would come round, and his mother would start to make these exotic European meals, and schnitzels and strudels and all that sort of thing. And his friends were very jealous, because they were heading off for like spuds and cabbage or something bland, So Charlie benefited from this book.
I mean, it's a fascinating choice, isn't it, Mark? Because it's personal, because my grandmother, my late grandmother, was very guarded about her particular family recipes that she had got from her mother. So there's a personal element to it, from a mother to a daughter, but also it's neutral in the sense that, if at any point authorities wanted to check your belongings, it's not like it's a diary of the family history or talking about bank accounts or something that might, endanger her. It's just recipes, as you say, for schnitzel and things like that. But personal at the same time. It's quite inspired choice, really, in some ways.
Yeah,
it works.
It's funny that you should mention that, because these two pages that we're looking at now, they are names and addresses of people that would assist Gertrude during the Kindertransport journey. Right. And you can see the second line. Now, the other thing is, it's been written in a sort of a childish, naive code. If you look at the bottom of the book, at the center spine, if you like, you can see 2 pages have been torn out. You can see the remnants of. So the left-hand side of this document, of this book, starts off, and you can see the second entry down, Society of Friends, Miss Kell, right? And then you would have 2 pages. And then on the next page, it continues, SEY, 1 Singerstrasse 16, which was the address of the Society of Friends in Vienna. So I suppose, the Gestapo are going to crack this code, like there's no doubt about it, but a border guard checking the little suitcase, and looking for something to pull them on, probably who doesn't know English that well, or if even at all, this sort of thing would probably get by. And well, it did, because we have it.
Wow.
So if you look at it, it's written across 2 pages. It is, and you can see further on down. So obviously we have seen a photograph of Miss Kelsey, Bridget Kelsey Hodgkin, and we've also seen a photograph around about the middle there. You can see Miss Mary Campbell, and obviously the name has been told to her phonetically, and she's written it as Mary, as in Merry Christmas, whereas the actual name is Mary. And you can see her address then, again, 2 pages on, is Bloomsbury House, London, WC1, which was the England headquarters, the England end, if you like, of the Kindertransport chain. And there are other addresses there relating to Belfast, Cromwell Road, Colenso Parade, Stranmillis. And the names there, S.W. Murray, Mrs. Johnson, Reverend Thompson. We still don't know to this day. I'm trying to find out now. I'm making inquiries that their role in all of this. But these are obviously people that could have helped her had she got lost or separated or, whatever. And it has been written in this childish code coded way, and it's quite an extraordinary document. So that's an example of what we still have from Vienna, really, in the Warmington family. So with Gertrude and Fritz, they settle initially in Millisle. Gertrude, then, if she's 15, a year later, back then at 16, you were more or less, you were considered an adult and you had to go and get a job. You know, there was no hanging about with mum and dad, bank of mum and dad or anything like that. Certainly not for these people. And she trained to be a nurse. She moved away from Millisle into Belfast because she was not permitted. She was still classed as an enemy alien, and she was not permitted to live to work more than 2 miles from her digs, you know, from her house. So she was placed in another address with another family, and she worked at hospital in Belfast. She met a doctor called Theodore Warmington, who happened to be a Quaker. And this obviously resonated with her. It was the Quakers that got her out of Vienna. And basically the nurse fell in love with the doctor, and they moved to Enniskillen and had Charlie and his brother. Wow. So that's her side of the story, if you like.
Yeah, and what level of English did she have when she arrived in Northern Ireland in the first place?
Yeah, that's I don't know. The 2 school reports that we have from her, which are quite strange, they cover 1 year, which was the year of the Anschluss, and the first term report is Austria. The school is in Austria. And the second term report, the school is in Deutschland. It's in Germany, but it's right. Yeah. The school hasn't moved, but the country has become Germany, if you like, or Deutschland. And there is a class, and there are marks for English studies. So she did study some English in school, probably, you know, between sort of 11 and 14.
And it's that situation at 15 years old, thrust into another country, you'd end up having to learn it just really, really quickly just to survive. So
you would learn everything quick, yeah. In her oral histories, which you can perhaps listen to, that they're held at the Northern Ireland War Memorial Museum, and you know, even when they were made, she still has a very pronounced. It's a beautiful accent because it's Austrian German, but it's also tinged with Fermanagh, which is an accent all of its own, you know, within Northern Ireland. So yeah, she definitely didn't lose it anyway, you know. So that was they're over to Northern Ireland. They get on with their lives. What happened in Vienna?
Right.
So Charlie, this is him, and this is in Vienna, and I managed to get him there in September 2024. So if you think that, you know, the D-Day book came out in June of that year, so then this is that September, and by that stage I had managed to get enough of the research. It come to a point really where I had to go there to follow up in various archives and on the ground, you know, with what we could find. Now, prior to that, in 2019, Charlie had made initial inquiries with 2 journalist friends. One was called Franziska Meinhardt, who's Austrian, and the other one, Noel Russell, who's from Belfast here. And they researched up to a point where they discovered about transport number 4. And this was the train that the family, or the parents, were put onto and deported from Vienna in 1941, in March 1941. Actually, tomorrow, 85 years ago to the day, on the 5th of March 1941. And there's a scheme across Europe, it's, pardon me, not just in Vienna, where it's called Stolperstein.
Yeah.
And choking up. And basically they mark the last known residence of families with little cobblestones, or like little brass cobblestones in the ground. So Franziska Meinhardt and Noel Russell, they arranged this for Charlie, and this is him back with me at the last address at Stefflergasse, the address that you saw on the ID card at the start of the slides, photographing the Stolperstein stones, and that's them on the ground. So you can see Leopold Kessler, Ernestine Kessler, deported to Modlin, which was a little village in eastern Poland. And Leopold, it says under his name, you can't really see it in that slide, but it says, killed, murdered during the Holocaust. And with Ernestine, it was survived the Holocaust. So Franziska Meinhardt, the journalist, made a note at that time. How did Ernestine survive? And this was the thing. How did she? And in fact, Charlie didn't know even Leopold's name until the late 1960s, let alone how he died or where he died. It's now known that he was murdered at Belzec death camp. So initially they went to Modlin, which was just a little hamlet, and the population was around 1,300 on the 4th of March, or the 5th of March even, and 2 days later, when this transport arrived, it more than doubled. Transport number 4 had 999 people on board. The Nazis tried to, as much as possible, make the numbers 1,000 per transport. However, the people were basically rounded up from their homes, like we see here, and they were brought to a holding camp within the city. And it was a repurposed school. This is a contemporary photograph of it in 1941 at a place called Kleinsperlgasse 2A. So when the people were brought here, they had to hand over their house keys, any money they had, and any identification documents like passports, anything like that. The documents were torn up in front of them, and the house keys were taken from them, and they were corralled into this school, which had been cleared out of desks and tables, and it was just an empty building. And a lot of people at that point realized the writing was on the wall, and they committed suicide. And with transport number 4, we believe that one of the proposed passengers did that. Because it wasn't built as a prison as such, it was a school. There were no bars on the windows. So the people literally threw themselves out of the top floor. And hence, we only had 999 people on transport number 4. There are records that state that out of transport number 4, there were only 13 survivors. I can't find a list of 13. I could find 4. And one of them was Ernestine Kessler. And we'll go on. I'll explain how she survived shortly. It's another amazing story. As you mentioned at the start, there's a lot of threads to this.
Yeah.
I'm sort of trying to concentrate.
And that's, I mean, your background, writing books and also your detective work is, you must have to be quite strict of when to kind of stop a line of inquiry, so to speak, in that the spider's web is interesting, but at the same time, you've got to stick to a core story, because if you follow all the spider's webs, you'd never get finished, and B, it would be a colossal project.
Well, I did try to. I thought about that, obviously, and as far as possible in the book, I have tried to bring everyone responsible to book at the end. And I think, if you recall, the D-Day book, I was able to do that. I found that the officer responsible for the murder of the Ulster rifleman and outlined his fate. And I've tried to do this as well with this book. But you're right, it could go on forever, because, just looking at this one family, the story spans the whole world. Now, just by the way people were dispersed. So if you look at this, the 1941 photograph, so this is Kleinsperlgasse. So I was able to bring Charlie here. And if you have a look at the chap in the background in the long dark coat, and then there's a dark doorway in the distance. So this is Charlie, and I've managed to he didn't realize why I asked him to stand there. So I've got him in the classic then now. He's exactly where his grandparents were loaded onto lorries and taken to a railway station.
Just for my own curiosity, Mark, when you were with Charlie there at these sites, were you towards the end of your research? Were you able to, or was it more during the beginning of the research? Because obviously going back and forth to Australia several times. I mean, where were you at your understanding of the story when you were there with him?
Yeah, this was probably 3/4 of the way through the research.
Right, so you're a good way in, yeah.
And I had, I think, started to write the initial chapters, the bit about Gertrude and Millisle and all that, obviously that was known. So I got cracking on with that. I'd done a lot of loose ends that I needed to follow up in Austria, and I still have, actually. I'll explain that later. But yeah, it was about sort of halfway, 3/4 way point.
Okay, thank you.
So this Klein Sparrow gas has been brought back to being a school again. And it was quite funny because we were standing out here, and you see two dodgy looking men standing outside a school with cameras. It's never a good look. And just, of course, at the time we were there, the bell rang and all the children just emptied out. And of course, they wanted to know what we were doing.
Understandably, to be fair, yeah.
And I thought, oh boy, this isn't going to go well. But remarkably, and this was something that Charlie really, he really picked up on. They knew why we were there, and they knew the history of their school, which was encouraging. They had been taught that history. And once they discovered who Charlie was, I explained, they all shook his hand and, wanted to know his name and exchange names, and then off they went to wherever children go at that age. But there was a moment where I thought, oh boy, we're going to end up in the chokey here, But no, it turned out really, really well, So the next port of call was the Aspang railway station. It no longer exists as a railway station, but you can see in the background there the train going past. The railway line still passes this point. And there's a large installation, you can see it in the foreground there, commemorating all of the deportations that took place from this very spot. And not so much at the school, but at this location and one or two others that we'll see. You had to give Charlie just space. Yeah. If you think about it, he was 75 years of age when he passed away. He was probably 74 then in this photograph. And this is the first time he's hearing this thing, this story about his family history. And it's coming from me, of all people. And, you tell him something, and there he is at that spot. And he has to process it and take it in and, deal with his own thoughts. And generally, I would just wander off. And Charlie actually went and he sat down on one of the benches that you see there. And sort of 15 minutes later, I wandered back again and off we went, without saying a word almost. It was just it took a bit of a toll on him, But so this was the location of the departures to Modlibor. In Modlibor, once the train arrived, there was nothing there. The local authorities had no warning that it was coming. There was no extra food brought in, no facilities. The synagogue put up around 60 people, and there were 4 outhouses connected to the synagogue, and about 14 or 15 people were placed in each of them. And the rest of the 999, or if you do the subtraction there, whatever that is, 910 or whatever, they were given a field, and that was it, just a field, to stand in, more or less. No shelter, no nothing. And conditions deteriorated to the extent that 6 months later, a local doctor from largest town nearby, which is about 10 miles away, carried out a bit of an audit. And out of the 999 people that arrived in March 1941, by September that year, there were only 700 left. People had just succumbed to exposure to the elements and disease and deplorable conditions. And it was at that stage that we discovered that Charlie's grandmother and another woman called Helena Koenig. Well, the other thing that happened was the men were taken away. The physically fit men were taken away to work forced labour in a quarry and on a road project nearby. So that left women, elderly, sick, and the very young in the ghetto at Modley. It wasn't fenced in or anything. There was nothing to fence in. There was no escape. It was just, I think, more or less a crossroads in the middle of nowhere. And the Einsatzgruppe and SS carried out raids regularly where they would have raped, murdered, beaten, robbed, and this went on. And eventually, we don't know how this came about, but Ernestine Kessler and the other woman, Helena Koenig, decided that they were going to get out. And they fled from the ghetto. They came up with a plan where they paid someone money, and depending on translation, he either had a lorry or a cart, and he was to take them back to Vienna. So they made it to the Polish border, whereupon he robbed them and kicked them out of the cart and left them. So the two women had to make it back, and this was December 1941, middle of winter, and they made it all the way back to Vienna on foot. And this is the start of the story of how Ernestine survived. About a year or so after that, the ghetto was liquidated and everyone was taken to the then newly built Operation Reinhardt death camp at Belzec and murdered. And so if she hadn't got out, that would have been her fate. And that essentially was the fate of her husband, Leopold. So she ends up back in Vienna. And what happens then, and how do we find out about it? If we hold that story, the other side of her family were called Schreckinger. And if you remember, they weren't Jewish. These people were Catholic. However, they were persecuted for a completely different reason. And on the right here, the group photograph. And the photograph itself is important, again, because we have it. So it had to come with Gertrude. Otherwise, we wouldn't have it. And the Ernestine is on the right of the photograph. You can see her with her arm up on a little plant stand. And this was taken in 1915. And the two gentlemen in uniform, I was able to identify them. The one on the right was called Anton Vogelsang, and he married the young lady between him and Ernestine, who is Ernestine's sister, Eleonora Schreckinger. She then became Vogelsang later. The other chap in the photograph is Joseph Brenner. Now, this fits into Charlie's little one-liner. He had two uncles, if you remember. Yeah. They were pulled in by the Gestapo for plotting to kill Hitler, and they were murdered by having dogs set on them. Now, Anton Vogelsang was obviously an uncle. Joseph Brenner, I couldn't find a genealogical link, but I assume, because he's in this photograph, that he is, if you like, similar to a good family friend that the younger members of the family would maybe call an uncle, Uncle Mark, Uncle Paul. He's not really an uncle, but he's such a good friend that he's treated like one. So they were, this is them in Austro-Hungarian First World War uniform. The chap on the left, Joseph Brenner, when you look at his little collar tags, he was actually flying corps.
Right.
And so they survived the war, the First World War. They then went to work in the railways. They got involved in trade unions and then in Socialist Party. And eventually, by the time the war had kicked off, or certainly at the time of the Anschluss, they had become communist resistance fighters in Austria or in Vienna. They were still working in the railways, and they operated resistance within the structure of the railway in Austria, or in Vienna, sorry. They were involved in sabotage. They would have placed explosives on lines. Simple things like mixing sand with grease so that it would wear down bearings quickly on the trains and whatnot. Diverting whole trains by changing the destination cards on the carriages. So you had whole trains of whatever, munition going hundreds of miles completely the wrong way. So this was the sort of thing that they were up to. That they were never trained or assisted to the extent where they could carry out military operations, in the way, if you remember, what is it, Operation Anthropoid, isn't it? Where
Anthropoid, yep.
Where Reinhardt was murdered. Well, not murdered. He was killed in action in Prague. So that they never got the backing or the training or the supplies to carry out that sort of activity. But nevertheless, they were a big pain for the Vienna Gestapo, to the extent that in late 1941, around about the time Ernestine was arriving back in Vienna, she probably would have realized that she could not seek refuge with this side of the family. The reason being that they were probably all arrested, which they were, and you can see on the left their Gestapo detention mugshots. Remarkably, these files still exist. They were found, and this is the thing about, if I had to research this 15 years ago, I wouldn't have found this. These files were found by accident in the Vienna State Archives when someone was looking in the cellars for something completely different.
Wow.
And a box of these detention files and Gestapo DRs, as I would call them, daily record sheets, were uncovered. And over the last 10 years, they've managed to get funding to digitize them and record them and put them online. So they're there. And as you can see, they're striking images, detention images. And if you look at the photograph on the right and you see Eleanor, she's got the same gaze as the photograph, the center mugshot. And when you look at the originals, she's actually got a black eye and a bruised cheek. She's been roughed up. So she was detained for 3 months and released. She was released on police bail, and she had to report to the local police station twice a week, which would in effect have ostracized her from her community. She would always have been suspected of informing, whether she was or not. And from her point of view, each time she reported, she would never have known if she was going to come back out again. She had quite a bad time. She survived the war, and she died in 1974. The other two guys, they were arrested as part of a group of 6, actually a larger group of 12, but they were then dealt with as a subgroup of that, as a group of 6 top communist resistance fighters in Vienna. They were sentenced at the Vienna People's Court to protective custody, is what it was called, which is a ludicrous term. And they were sent to Mauthausen camp. Now, something happened between leaving the People's Court and arriving at Mauthausen. Word had been sent to the camp that these 6 men, the 2 you see here and 4 others, weren't to be permitted to enter the camp population. So the train pulled up at Mauthausen, and there's quite a steep hill that everyone's forced to climb from the railway station up to the camp, and they're beaten the whole way up. And they got to the top. There were some like roughly 100 people on board this train. The 6 men had previously been singled out, even while they were on board the train. They were stripped naked, and they had their hands tied behind their backs. And when they got to the front of the camp, they were forced to run across the frontage of the camp. And the camp commandant, a guy called Backmeyer, let loose 2 trained Great Dane dogs. And the 6 men were mauled almost to death over a period of 15 minutes. And there are 3 witnesses to this who recorded testimony after the war for war crimes trials, and I have their statements. And again, I found an initial story, and I've now corroborated it twice.
Wow.
So this did
tragically that you did corroborate it. It would have been better in some ways if it turned out not to be true. But
well, again, I mean, how do I explain that to Charlie? That's the thing. And it was down to me to do that. So they were then taken to the camp hospital, which wasn't really a hospital. It basically was used to determine whether anyone was fit to work or not. Yeah. And if you may know, Mauthausen is the camp that had the stairs of death connected with a quarry. And so working there was important, and being fit to work was important. So after 2 days, after they languished with their wounds, 2 days, I know you won't be able to read the handwritten note here, but this is from the camp register, death register. And again, it just strikes me that all of these documents, from the train passenger lists, the Gestapo DR files, you've got German efficiency here all the way through. And thankfully, I've been able to, if you like, turn it against them, because it's fair, and it's evidence against what actually happened. And if you translate this little one line, this is Anton Vogelsang's entry. There's an identical entry for the other 5, and it states killed on the orders of Reichsfuhrer SS. So that was Heinrich Himmler himself, and it shows you the level at which they were viewed upon by the German Nazi high command, where you have Himmler himself directing that these 6 men be shot, which they were.
Yeah.
So I thought
it's a testament to their reputation from Vienna. The resistance activities they're involved in were obviously annoying people at a sufficiently high level for them, as you say, to be singled out right from the beginning of their process. Yeah.
They weren't sentenced to death at the court. They were sentenced to protective custody. Yeah. They should have been taken to the camp and went in, and they probably would have died through work. And it was a death camp through work, really. But it wasn't a death camp in the same way that Belzec was. They certainly should have been allowed to live on day one, but they weren't. And that was on Himmler's direction, which is bizarre. So then we come down to the other bit of Charlie's little one-line story, where he said there was a monument somewhere in Vienna or somewhere in Austria to these men and to the 2 uncles. And I managed to find that, and this is it. And it's the center stone here. There's 3 stones either side. There's 3 behind Charlie and 3 to the right. And the 3 to the right, the one with the wreath on it, is Anton Vogelsang's name. And Joseph Brenner, the other uncle that may not be an uncle, is in the middle. And then there's one of the other 4 to the right. And in the center, it says, fallen in the fight against fascism, Mauthausen, and the date, which I can't really read, but I think it was 16th of July, 1942. So I managed to find this. Once I researched the story, once I got the name Vogelsang, really, and there's another whole episode to how that came about, which you can read in the book without doing a plug, but I don't want to keep everyone.
You're allowed to do a plug, that's fine.
But once I got the name Vogelsang, which, isn't a common name, I then latched onto the Mauthausen story and corroborated that. So we were able to bring Charlie here. And what happened was in 1946, why are these graves, if you like, in Vienna when they were murdered at Mauthausen? And there's one bit of the story I still need to nail down. And it's that in 1946, when the camp was liberated in 1945, the surviving inmates made an oath. It's called the Mauthausen Oath. Basically, that this would never happen again, and they would ensure the memory of those who were murdered, if at all possible. And apparently, when they were shot on the directions of Himmler, they were taken to the crematorium and incinerated. But apparently someone recovered their ashes and secretly buried them at Mauthausen. And in 1976, they were exhumed and brought to Vienna and buried here, 6 sets of ashes. Now, I suppose that could have happened, or are these ashes representative of the men? I don't know. I can't really nail that down. And this was carried out by an organization called KZ Verband, or Kzetche Verband in German, which translated means the Concentration Camp Association, which were set up like similarly to perhaps a military veterans welfare association, looking after families and that, after the war. It's still going on today. It still exists. So the 6 men were reburied here. So we brought Charlie back here, and this was another walk away for 15 minutes moment. And just behind his leg, you can't see it. There's a little stone. Well, there's one on the right there. You can see a little stone cube. And on the left, there was another one, but there's a lantern on the one on the left. And Charlie, he looked down. He said, "Mark, there's a candle flickering in that." And I went, "Yeah, right." And then I looked, and sure enough, there was something flickering. And I thought it was one of those little electronic imitation candles. And I opened the door, and it was actually a proper wax candle that had been lit. And you can see there's a little wreath on Anton Vogelsang's memorial stone there. So we're sort of thinking, gosh, someone must have been here, within maybe the last hour, which is quite a thought. That we'd almost maybe met someone who
wow, yeah,
more about this story. There is someone there who knows. But so that sort of nailed down that part of the story. So then we were left with Ernestine Kessler. If you remember, we left her after her mammoth trek back to Vienna with Helena Koenig. So in that same cemetery where you saw the photograph earlier, we went to the other side of it, and I thought it'd be a good idea to visit Charlie's grandmother's grave. She died in 1991, I think, 1990 or 91. So she survived the Holocaust, lived quite a long life, but we don't know how. Well, we didn't. We do now. And it's all because of this gravestone. And again, this is what I mentioned before. It's like looking at things in context rather than just going here and saying, there's Ernestine Kessler's grave. Okay, where do we go now? But it's, hang on a minute, Charlie. There's 3 names here. And the name at the top is Marie Helene Pekarovich. And if you look, she has a birth date. I think it's 26th, the 1st, 1883. And she also has a death date, which was 1940. And beneath her is Karl. It looks like Carla, but there's a V there, and I don't know why, because he wasn't like von Pekarovich, like von Richthofen or something like that, but I don't know, but it's there. So that's Karl Pekarovich, who was her husband. And he only has a death date, and it's 1948. And then you have Ernestine Kessler, and she has no dates. So this tells me that the middle person, Karl Pekarovich, knew everything there is to know about the top person because he was married to her, Marie Helene. So he knew her date of birth and her date of death, which was 1940, which is relevant. The next person down, Karl, when he died, all that was known about him was his death date. And that was known by the bottom person, Ernestine Kessler. Karl Pekarovich was a photographer. I believe he took the group photograph that we saw earlier, and he was a family friend, and he lived round about 200 meters from the Kesslers, both the Kessler and Schreckinger families. They all lived really within 200 meters radius of each other's. And Ernestine would have known that his wife had died in 1940 before she left for the ghetto on transport number 4. She obviously realized that he would have had space in his house because his wife was gone. And she went to Pekarovich's house, knocked the door after, and this would have been January 1942, knocked the door and asked, could he take her in? And of course, he had a dilemma. Does he open the door and leave himself open for his own death? If the two of them were caught, they'd both be sent to concentration camps and effectively murdered. Or does he close the door in her face and let her wander the streets in Vienna in January? So he did the right thing, and he brought her in. And in Austria, you have your grave booked, if you like. You know, you're walking about right as rain, but somewhere there's a gravestone with your name on it. And it's quite a thought, you know, it's quite memento mori and all that. But this is what Karl had done for Ernestine. He sort of willed, if you like, that she would be placed in this family plot on her death, and also that she would assume control of the property where he lived, which was on a street called Roscherstrasse.
Good grief. And
he died in 1948, and there's records that she remained in that property till around 1960. And how she survived there is due to his profession. He had 2 studios, and at one point I've been able to find out that he had actually 4 properties in Vienna. He was quite a well-off photographer, quite a successful photographer. This is his twilight years. Obviously, he died in 1948 in his mid-60s, I think, or maybe a bit older. And he started to trim down the business. And if you think about it, there was an apartment above a studio. So if Ernestine was pottering about upstairs, she wasn't going to make noise that would be heard downstairs because there was no one there. You know, if she's using the bathroom or if she drops something or whatever. But basically, she hid in Pekarovich's apartment for 3.5 years, in the same way that we know Anne Frank hid in Amsterdam. She hid in Vienna until the Soviet army liberated the city. And she was freed, if you like, and she continued to live on in that house. Now, this is the bit that I told you I had a little add-on. I didn't know if we have time to cover it. But
we'll do it just whatever. Yeah, loving it. Well, finding it moving. Yeah.
So the International Red Cross set up a system whereby notes, like little telegrams, if you like, of 25 words could be sent to displaced people. And that included, of course, the Kinder children. Now, there was one message sent, which is sort of perfectly normal, if this is normal, you know, earlier than this one that I'm going to show you. And this one is dated at the top, February. I can't really see it there, but it's February 1942. And this would coincide with the time that Ernestine has just really arrived at Pekarovich's studio. And the departure address, if you like, for this telegraph or this message is Zrinagasse 48. That wasn't Ernestine Kessler's house. It wasn't Pekarovich's house either, but I do know that he had a house on that street, or a property. It's leveled now and it's like an industrial area. And it may have been a storehouse or something to do with his photography business. We don't know. This is one of the things that I'm still working on. But I would refer to it as a drop address, really. It was a safe address that could be used, that didn't compromise Ernestine Kessler's security, the fact that she was staying at Rochestrasse. So this is sent to, as you can see, it's sent to Millisle via Belfast, and it's sent to Gertrude. And the 25 words that she's allowed to write are, "Dear children, we are healthy." Note that she uses plural. We are healthy. How are you? Give us an answer soon. What are you doing there? Give us your address. Greetings, your parents, plural. So she's trying to create the impression that all is well and that both her and Leopold are still together. Whereas, as this was written, Leopold was slated for Belzec. He hadn't arrived there yet, but that's where he was going. So it's replied to a couple of months later by Gertrude. At this stage, she's moved to another address at Daravolgi because, if you recall, she's taken up her nursing training. Yep. And it's "Dear parents," so that's plural. So it's worked. Ernestine has got Gertrude to believe that both her parents are together. "We are happy and well," i.e. her and Fritz, her brother. "We're happy and well with your letter. New places and wonderful good friends. Take care, write soon. Don't worry, lots of kisses." And that's signed from Gertrude with her new address. Now, this is important because Ernestine wasn't finished here. She had a plan. And what she did was she got Pekarovich to take a photograph of her in his studio. And if you look at this photograph, you can see, I mean, first of all, if anyone's, any of your viewers, would you go and get your photograph taken in your overcoat? You'd have probably a nice dress, or, you wouldn't have your overcoat and your gloves and your hat. And, you know what I mean? You'd come into the studio dressed like that, but the photograph wouldn't be taken like that.
Yeah.
So you have to bear in mind that Gertrude had been robbed. She'd probably any rings that, now Leopold, her husband, had trained as a jeweler, and his specific trade was a ring maker before that he was persecuted and put out of business. If she had any rings, distinctive rings, Gertrude, as her daughter, maybe more so than Fritz, her son, would certainly recognize them and spot them. So she's wearing gloves here for a start. Her hair is cut short. In the ghetto, I've found letters from other people in the same ghetto who were writing to family, and they'd stated that they had to cut their hair into a bob, the females, in order to stop the spread of lice. So again, you can see Gertrude's hair is cut pretty short, and she put a little hat on. And the coat that she's wearing doesn't just fit. It's a bit short in the sleeve and a little bit short in the hem. And I believe that this is Marie-Helene Pekarovich's clothes.
Right.
That Karl still had in the property after her death.
It looks more like a sort of an official photo. I mean, not like a passport photo, because that'd be a headshot, but it's not a very warm photo to pose for, to send to your kids, who are a long way away. I think your detective work about what's going on there is very right. Adam in the audience said maybe she's trying to also hide how thin she is.
Yes, well. I see that. Yeah, absolutely. She's a couple of layers on there. She's not looking into the lens, which she's looking to the right of the lens, which is probably where Pekarovich is standing. If you can imagine, this is like a big box plate camera, and well, the plate bit, I'll come to that in a second. And he's maybe standing beside it with a little cable release, and she's getting instructions from him on what to do. And if you look at the crease across the photograph, that's relevant, because in the previous message, you can see it has been folded twice.
Right.
And the photograph, if you were to fold that crease up, which I wouldn't do because it could fall apart, it fits into one of those
Right.
squares. The other thing is, we have this photograph and we have the previous message. So it has been sent to Belfast, and then it's been sent back to Vienna. And then what happens? Well, it has been sent within the cover of another Red Cross letter. And on the back of the photograph, it says, "With heartfelt love to my dear children from your mummy. Father didn't want to come along in case he broke the camera." I've got camera in here, but actually, if the proper, you can see it, the word before the end there. I don't know any German at all, but he would break the plate, i.e. the plate of the camera. So she's trying to make a joke. She's trying to make a joke of why Dad isn't there. He's so ugly, he'd break the camera.
Yeah, he cracked the mirror. Yeah.
He doesn't want to play. And this photograph it's just one of the most amazing photographs that I have seen. On the face of it, a very simple thing. And in fact, it has remained in the family, and the family have looked at it. Charlie looked at it and other members of the family, and they just saw a photograph of Ernestine. There's a photograph of Granny. Oh, right. But it has to be put in context. How did it get here? How did it get to Belfast? And it is, in fact, I would call this photograph proof of life. How does she let her children know that she is still alive? And not only that, but let them know that there shouldn't be any reason why she wouldn't be alive. They don't know about concentration camps. They don't know.
It's all normal. Dad's just not here because he's, yeah.
So she's come up with this plan with Pekarovich, and I think it's astounding. What are the words that she could send this photograph? How it was finally sent, I still to figure out. But when you look at the original, and if you shine an oblique light, strong light, you can actually see the impression of 2 round stamp marks where it has gone back through the system. And you could probably, if you did a proper job on it, you could probably line it up with the previous document and figure that, the stamp marks coincide with, that I can't see it on my version, but there are 2 stamps on that image. So she's able to send proof of life and reassure the family that she still exists. Not, however, her husband. And so the next stop, of course, bring Charlie to the studio. And this is one of the most frustrating things because it's vacant and there's a sign. We have moved, we've moved around the corner beside the flower shop. I think it says something like that. And if you look at the door, it's not PVC double glazing. It actually looks original. And when you look in, there is this vacant space that looks like it could be the studio. And I don't know about you, but if I was in there hiding for 3.5 years, I would want, and if you think at any moment the door could come in around you and you could be dragged away by the Gestapo and never seen again, literally put up a chimney as dust, I would want to write somewhere in there, leave some sort of mark. That I would have it scraped all over the place. Mark Scott, date of birth, address, God save the king, whatever else. I would want something there to let people know that I actually lived.
I existed. I was here.
Has that happened? I don't know. I intend to go back to Vienna in May and have a look. If it's still vacant, the journalist I mentioned earlier, Francisca, she obviously would be the better one to communicate our intentions with the people who own this, and because she can speak the language, obviously. And if we can get in, have a good look around. I know it's, obviously the upstairs apartment, there's probably someone living there and you don't want to go in and start searching their house, but it's just one of those things that I think is worth doing. And if I never look, I'll never find, that's.
Yeah, no, definitely.
But so there we bring Charlie to it, and it's quite a photograph, Charlie looking in through the window. This is where his grandmother hid for 3.5 years. Unbelievable. And that is where I come to an end. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the book is dedicated to the memory of Charlie Warmington, the journalist. He was prolific within the BBC in Northern Ireland. During the Troubles here, he was head of BBC News. He then went into entertainment. He was executive producer for BBC Friday Night Entertainment in Northern Ireland. He produced the Patrick Kielty show here.
All right, yeah.
It was called PK Tonight. And he, in that role, he met so many big stars of the day. Oliver Reed, he told me a fantastic story about how he was, well, when we were in Vienna, we'd be out on the ground, as you've seen, and we'd usually end up in a pub, as you do, and debrief. And he would come out with all these stories, you know, and how he managed to get Oliver Reed in the studio in Belfast, sober, for 10 o'clock at night for the PK.
Yes, that's quite an achievement. Yeah.
It was an achievement. He was actually very proud of that. But well, I don't think he made the sober bit, but he got him there. But yeah, so he was a great guy. He, at the end up, he went into newspaper journalism, and he wrote under the name of the Roamer. So a lot of people didn't really know him as such. They might have known the name, but probably couldn't put a face to it. And it's through his job there that I came to meet him. So that's basically, well, it's not basically the story. There's an awful lot more. There's how of the 4 people that I discovered survived transport number 4, 3 of them, Helena Koenig, the other escapee, if you like, Ernestine, and a doctor called Paul Messenger, they all met at the end of the war, and they had to actually vouch for each other. They had to prove that they weren't Nazis. And if you think about it, Ernestine appeared out of nowhere. They're termed U-boot, as in U-boat or submarine, because they lived under the surface. And so she appeared out of nowhere with no ID, no nothing. And she had to find 2 other survivors to vouch for her. And how do you find 2 other survivors in a Holocaust? You know, but that's So again, I explain all that and a lot of other detail besides. That's my book.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, again, folk, the links are in the description below. But we had a couple of questions. I mean, most of them we covered answers as we went along. But Andreas asked very on, did Charlie feel a connection to Vienna when he was there? Obviously, just on the pure research and following his family's footsteps, there's that aspect. But, you know, he's obviously a Northern Irishman by birth, by culture. But did he kind of feel something there when he was over there in Vienna?
He did. And that stemmed from the initial trip, you know, the Stolperstein trip.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Viennese authorities extended Austrian citizenship to families descended from people who had been displaced during the Holocaust. And Charlie, I believe, actually had begun the process of applying for Austrian citizenship. So the answer to that one is a big yes. He definitely had an affinity to Austria and to Vienna in particular.
Okay, thank you. And people are asking about whether there was any reunion post-war. Did Gertrude meet anybody from Austria? Did Ernestine make contact? What?
Ernestine did. This is actually probably quite the sad bit, or one of the many sad bits of the story. She eventually made it after some years. You know, she spent quite a while tracking down her family. If you can imagine, then, you know, there's just about a mail system, let alone WhatsApp And I think it was the early 50s. She made her way to Enniskillen, and at that stage, unfortunately, the dream was over. Her 2 children had grown up. Ernestine had Charlie and his other brother, Alan. You know, she didn't want to go back to Vienna. She was an Enniskillen girl at that stage. The other son, Fritz, had gone to, I think, Wolverhampton, where he studied engineering, and he then traveled the world as an engineer. And the family wasn't a family anymore, although they'd found each other. She, you know, Gertrude didn't want to go to Vienna. Ernestine didn't want to stay in Northern Ireland. And she went back to Vienna the family did visit occasionally over the years, but she stayed in Bakarovich's apartment until around about 1960. And then I think she must have sold it up, and she set up a high-end catering business in London, where she would, cater to, I don't know, groups, I suppose gentlemen's clubs and people like that, quite high-end. And she ran that business for some time before moving back to Vienna. And that's obviously where she died and was buried in 1990. So yeah, in answer to that, it was quite heartbreaking because she'd lost her husband, she'd found her children, but she'd lost their childhood. That was robbed from her.
It's one of those recurring things when you read. I've read lots of memoirs of like Auschwitz survivors, things like that, and you're always, when you know people survive, you read these books hoping for this kind of glorious Hallmark movie of the week kind of happy ending, and often there isn't one. The people have once lives are split in a very, very dramatic way like this, and roots take place elsewhere, it can be very hard to kind of go back and try and, you can't go back, you can't bring back the people who are dead, you can't go back to how it was. So sometimes the best way is to kind of keep the split, because it sort of makes more sense than falsely trying to go back to a time that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, and I think there's nothing to think about here. There's Gertrude's husband's side of the family, and if you think about it, back then I think she was, his mother was quite religious, quite staunchly Baptist, and if you think about it, here's this woman coming from Vienna, and in Northern Ireland, of course, we have got a Protestant, well, we did have, we'll always have this Protestant Catholic thing going on, which has hit the news occasionally. And, you've this woman coming from Vienna who's essentially been, for want of a better phrase, shacked up with this guy. What was the story there? What did happen? Who knows? But this would have been going on in her head. And I don't think she got a good reception from that side of the family generally.
Right.
So there was that going on as well, which is an awful thing, when you consider what she'd gone through, to save her, and to find her children again.
And humans are very good at just blocking out all the shit stuff, and trying to find a new path and dealing with it. And but to bring it back, what I feel is really, well, the whole story has been moving and fascinating on so many levels. But the family legend, as you said at the beginning, was pretty much 90% true. And your work, your incredible work, let's not belittle the work you did, but it corroborated it all. And you brought a resolution. And Susan, you in the audience said, in a way, Charlie did bring them together again through Mark. The family were, at least in print, the family are together as one story. So that your book has done a job.
Well, that's Charlie's legacy, really, isn't it? That this has, he did go down that road. We did have that connection that day, when he came to my house, and I made the joke about having a go at the Nazis, which could have gone very wrong, but it didn't. And that's, here we are. And, he did know all this before he passed away. Before he went to the grave. So, Yeah, Gunnar
is just correcting me, saying we're not good at putting stuff away. We're good at pretending we've put stuff away. We're good at pretending we've moved on. He's right there. It's trauma. Yeah, we lock things up and pretend things are good, but
it's like
but they aren't always there. Well, Mark, you've now got me thinking about when your next email is going to arrive in my inbox with the next story, because
well, I'm back in that doldrum. What am I going to do now? But I don't know. Maybe I'll just retire again. but I don't know. I just don't know what's around the corner.
Well, it's been brilliant stuff. So, folks, you know what to do. Go and get the book. And what an incredible show. So don't forget, folks, I'm an hour early tomorrow. We've got a second part of our oil presentation with Anand Trapani. Looking forward to that. And then I'm talking to other people over the course of the next few days. Check all the schedules. Consider becoming a patron. And again, Mark, it's been absolutely delightful listening to you. And folks, I will see you all again tomorrow. Thank you very much for your comments and questions. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Paul. Bye.
Bye.